I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
And I'm Inez Stepman.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. On today's episode, we've got an array of topics, some very timely and newsworthy, others a bit more evergreen as we move towards a much-needed holiday break. Will is going to start us off by talking about the invasion at the southern border. I'll talk a little bit about America's explicit turn towards negotiating with terrorists. Inez is going to talk a bit about the pending decision to remove the National Reconciliation Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery. And last but not least, Amber will talk a bit about the left's attack on homeschooling. So with that, let's turn it over to Will.
All right. So the last few days have seen a massive surge in illegal crossings at the border. At Eagle Pass, Texas, they're looking at 4,000 some crossings in the Tucson sector, 3,000 some crossings in just 24 hours. I think that Bill Malugin reported that per Border Patrol sources, there were more than 12,600 migrants in the last 24 hours. And that's the highest single day total ever recorded in our nation's history. I mean, you don't have to, if you just extrapolate that out, 12,000 illegal crossings times what, almost 365, you're looking at almost 4 million illegal immigrants in a single year. That's just shocking, an astounding, complete invasion of our country at the southern border. Nobody can really handle it. You've seen that the Biden administration has actually shut down 2 railway bridges in order to help redirect Border Patrol personnel to deal with all the crossings and help with the processing problem. But that means that you have a massive shutdown in rail traffic and freight rail traffic coming from Mexico. So that's having massive economic impacts. You're looking at a situation where you've got an increase in the backlog of pending immigration cases of over 1 million, to the point that we now have 3 million pending immigration cases. Every single immigration judge has 4,500 cases each in their current backlog. So our system's completely overwhelmed. The Biden administration, the whole joke about the border being secure, obviously not. The videos that we're seeing are just thousands of people who've already crossed and are waiting for processing. And the Biden administration isn't doing a thing about it. To the extent they're negotiating over it, they're saying, oh, well, we'll agree to some more border security if you guys agree to send 100 million to Ukraine, or 100 billion to Ukraine, rather. Basically blackmailing our own country. And it's also very much in bad faith. This is kind of the double game I've been talking about, which is they have the tools at their disposal to do something about this right now. They could reinstate Title 42. They could do any number of things, like they could declare national emergency. They could effectively reinstate remain in Mexico. They could do any number of things to stop this massive flood of people coming over the border that they clearly can't handle. And to the point that they have to take Border Patrol agents from basic customs work, important customs work, to allow trade to go back and forth across the border. They have to take those people, shut down international rail traffic in order to move people to help process illegal immigrants. It's a complete disgrace. It's in so many different ways. And it just demonstrates a level of contempt for the people who live here that's really remarkable. Like basically everything in service of the goal of, basically changing the composition of the country to increase the number of Democratic votes. And they're willing to completely sacrifice the safety of the southern states, the economy of the southern states now, because they're having to shut down international rail bridges. It's truly obscene. So I could just get angrier and angrier about this, but it makes a mockery of our country, and it's a reminder that it's just very important that Democrats lose the next presidential election, so we have someone who's willing to do something about this.
As much as I like blaming Democrats, and everything that Will said is of course true, it's important, I think, to remember this is a 3-branch failure and bipartisan failure that has been going on for decades. We shouldn't be relying on Title 42 to do basic border enforcement. It's an emergency measure for a pandemic. The fact that our entire border enforcement hinged on a COVID emergency measure is itself insane. You have the Flores settlement that makes it difficult to process claims appropriately and not without separating families. And we saw the whole, brouhaha that happened with that. Our immigration laws themselves are a magnet. The way that we do have set chain migration incentives are a magnet for people to try to get one person across. And then, of course, enforcement has been lacking. We don't have enough people to process asylum claims. Our asylum law itself is insane. It grants way too much processing time and requirements to obviously false claims of asylum. So, I mean, and I know Will agrees with all of this as well, but we have not had a serious border policy like a proper country ought to for decades. And also worth remembering that one of the first sort of popular rebellions in the Republican Party was against amnesty under George W. Bush when that was proposed, in 2007. So this is something where the base has understood this to be a problem for a very long time. The Republican Party really, up until some of the Tea Party people, and then most famously Trump, weren't even speaking to where most Americans are on immigration, both legal and illegal. And frankly, even though we've had more Republicans speaking the way that we'd like them to speak, even under Trump, right, there was this limited executive things that the border was definitely more controlled under the Trump administration than it has been under Biden. But there were still a hell of a lot of crossings, illegal crossings, and things being smuggled back and forth across the border because the structure of the law and the way our immigration policy works itself is the problem. So I don't want to sort of take the shot at Democrats, well deserved, of course, without pointing out that this has been a Republican problem. This is a both parties problem. This is an all three branches of the federal government problem. This has been, a judicial problem. We're not allowing the southern and border states to enforce their borders when the federal government refuses to do that job. I mean, there's all kinds of sort of issues here that have been going on for a long time. I just one brief little note. I don't think there has been a more successful political gambit or trick than sending migrants to New York City and to Cape Cod. I think that really did change the minds of a lot of closed-minded Democrats who didn't care about the problems of the border until they were dumped on their doorstep. And here I'm talking literally about myself because we have a migrant shelter now 3 blocks away that is causing all the problems that you might imagine. But when even the mayor of New York City, Mayor Adams is out there complaining about the problems that these migrants cause, both financial and in terms of law and order. I think that's a success in terms of at least spreading some of the pain beyond the border states that have been dealing with this pain for decades and been called racist for bringing the problems up.
Inez raises an important point about the fact that so much of our border policy is contingent on executive powers that can be done or undone with the sign of a pen. I mean, the reason the border was able to unravel so quickly is that all of the policies that Trump had put in place via executive fiat when Biden took office were quickly undone, whether it was the Remain in Mexico policy, whether it was the negotiation with Mexico such that they would use their own National Guard to help police the border, whether it was a bunch of public charge rules, eliminating some of the pull factors, like getting rid of certain welfare benefits for individuals who came across the border illegally, the so-called family separation policy, which was completely a misnomer for reasons I'm sure our audience understands. And then Biden just undid all of that immediately. And by the spring of 2021, one of the most underreported stories, I think, about the border crisis is that Biden started borrowing employees from other parts of the federal government and sending them down to the border for months-long stints where they had to work 12-hour days to help basically get these people in detention centers, get them processed. He sent down 500 employees from the U.S. Department of Agriculture to help with this problem. And since then, nothing has changed. In fact, it's seemingly only gotten worse to the point that the president's own party is starting to rebel against him. You've always had Henry Cuellar from Texas being a pretty vocal proponent of increasing border security, but now the Democrats have this thorn in their side of Mayor Eric Adams in New York, who's effectively been shunned from the party because of his public statements on this matter. And now you have John Fetterman, who in an interview with NBC News last week declared that he is not a progressive, contrary to what he said on the campaign trail, and instead said that Democrats have to have a conversation with Republicans about border security, and it's not xenophobic to suggest that securing your border is a serious policy that any sovereign nation should have. So I feel like the one benefit, I suppose, of immigration right now being really contingent on the executive is that you are able to see this very stark contrast between a Republican in office and a Democrat in office, and how they handle this issue, how quickly things become a crisis, how quickly things unravel, to the point that members of their own party are starting to rebel.
I think it's notable that, Inez referenced Eric Adams as one of the few blue city mayors to say anything, let alone try to do anything about this issue, speak out against the Biden administration, that just coincidentally, then he has the FBI sicked on him and prosecutors pursuing him. And that to me was a signal, call it a conspiracy theory if you like, but that to me was a signal to other blue city Democrats or other representatives, you better get in line, you better not criticize the administration over this, or there's going to be hell to pay for it. But I think it creates a lot of problems. I mean, beyond the gambit of having blue jurisdictions have to deal with the consequences of these policies, which the voters there obviously are going to ultimately disapprove of, even if ideologically they're on board with open borders and that having sovereignty is a racist and bigoted concept. There are going to be real knock-on consequences here beyond the decay in streets and crime and all the other associated societal maladies, which put Democrat representatives in jurisdictions that have to deal with these problems in a real bind vis-a-vis the administration. Beyond that, as well noted, now you have the economic knock-on effects that are clear to see when it comes to potentially slowdowns in freight traffic. And I'd extend this to something even more global, which is in the Red Sea right now, you have no U.S. naval force protecting commerce there. What happens to the extent that extends to other waterways in the Middle East and beyond? What happens ultimately to the extent, of course, there's an incursion by China into Taiwan, and what happens to the seas around China? So you could see this very quickly turning into a massive global issue with macroeconomic consequences. Obviously, on the southern border, you also have the terrorism threat and threats from other state adversarial actors. So put it all together, and that is an awful lot of chaos, which comes down to the basic acts of, when it comes to our borders, obviously defending our sovereignty and actually having a nation that territory is secure. And then also the job of the U.S. to secure waterways so that we can actually engage in commerce around the world. These are kind of the most basic and fundamental duties and obligations of an administration. And I wouldn't call them failures. I think from the administration's perspective, these are successes because these are the obvious consequences of policies that were consciously made. This is the predictable catastrophe, but I think from the administration's perspective, these are actually successes. And the one thing I'd say, on the Republican side of this is, how come there's no Tommy Tuberville-like stand that anyone is taking about this? I mean, an invasion that's being welcomed by Commander-in-Chief and then the Secretary of Homeland Security and beyond. I mean, this is the most utter and disastrous of failures that an administration could engage in, arguably, not being able to defend, and not only not being able to defend, but actually choosing to have your borders overrun as an explicit policy. There's almost no more impeachable act. Obviously, we can conjure them up, but if that's not an impeachable offense, I don't know what is. The fact that there is no one even really banging the table, making the case that these are impeachable offenses, even if you think impeachment at the end of the day is not a measure that actually forces any change, what kind of punishment is being put in place? None. So there's zero accountability, and it's just going to incentivize more lawlessness going forward. So it's an utter abomination all around, and really a pox on every house, from my view. Turning to, I guess, another pox on our house, I was struck recently by what I think, by all accounts, looks like a puff piece in the Wall Street Journal for a special envoy that probably most Americans didn't even know we had, which is a special presidential envoy for hostage affairs. This is an office which has been promoted now to an ambassador level position, led by someone named Roger Carstens, who's a former Green Beret. And his full-time job is to deal now with hostage negotiations. The fact that this position, this perch, even exists in America, to me, is an utterly damning indictment of the fact that there is zero deterrence whatsoever, and that we are going to accept it now that foreign powers, adversaries, can detain Americans and use them as negotiating chips to extract concessions from us. Obviously, rogue powers have always tried to engage in such nefarious acts, but the simple policy ought to be, from my perspective, if any foreign power touches the hair on the head of an American citizen, then we will unleash the full power of America on them to get that citizen back. There's zero deterrence, self-evidently here, because we now have a position that deals with managing the notion that there are dozens of hostages, American hostages, being taken by adversaries. And that's an acceptable problem, essentially, to have. So this article goes into sort of what Carstens' role is, the negotiations for Brittany Griner, and then, of course, the recent negotiations with Iran, which led to a hostage exchange wherein there was a trade of prisoners. And then we also gave Iran $6 billion on the back end of it as well. So $1 billion per person, per American exchange. And this obviously only incentivizes further hostage taking and holding out for even greater gains going forward. There's an amazing quote in here from Carstens where he says, "There's a saying that we have in my office that the United States does not negotiate with terrorists, but we do." Again, this is to some extent celebrated in the piece. The piece does go on to talk about, well, there's some people who actually have a bit of an issue with this, and maybe negotiating with terrorists isn't such a good idea. But essentially, the studies are inconclusive about whether or not this is going to lead to foreign powers pursuing Americans. But I think it's clear that what we're saying as a nation, when you elevate someone to this position, is that negotiating with terrorists and negotiating with other rogue adversaries actually is a conscious U.S. policy. This is something that's acceptable. And I think it guarantees future hostage taking and far more disgusting scenarios going forward. I mean, obviously, we see this out in the open, although Carstens' office itself is not responsible for these negotiations. Using Qatar as a chief mediator and the Biden administration bending over backwards to thank Qatar, which harbors Hamas and has been responsible for flowing hundreds of millions of dollars into Gaza to Hamas effectively in recent years, bending over backwards to celebrate all they're doing to try and negotiate, again, further disastrous hostage trades at ridiculously beneficial ratios for Hamas, plus the associated ceasefires and resupplying of Hamas. It shows you that this is U.S. policy now. We actually do negotiate with terrorists, and it's almost celebrated effectively. Another telling line worth recounting from this piece, this is a quote from Carstens: "The deterrence strategy," which of course should be the most important part of this, we should never have any foreign power even think about taking Americans hostage. "The deterrence strategy is in its infancy," Carstens says, "with two people on his team working full-time on possibilities, including the encouragement of like-minded countries to join an international coalition against hostage taking. He also wants to extend the infrastructures that is built up around state hostage taking by talking with U.S. allies about creating their own equivalents of his job." To me, this entire sordid episode is an absolute outrage. The fact that you have no one on the Hill even talking about this, as best I can tell, is really jaw-dropping, although not at all surprising. But this just strikes me as another massive dereliction of duty, appeasement to the nth degree, and it's going to lead to far worse episodes, I think, to come for America's national interest. So I don't necessarily have a pointed question out of that, but I wonder what you all make, I guess, of the elevation of this position to ambassador level, and the fact that we're now just accepting the fact that we negotiate with terrorists in all manner of disastrous deals.
I would just jump in with an example of exactly what you're talking about, which is the recent Iran deal to release some hostages in exchange for freeing up $6 billion of Iranian money. And that was really explained away by the foreign policy establishment as this idea that the money always belonged to Iran. So, freeing it up really costs the United States nothing, which is such an ignorant way of looking at the situation, because obviously money is fungible. And giving them that $6 billion towards their oil obviously frees up other money for them to engage in all kinds of nefarious activity. So I think routinely in these situations, we tend to elevate the release of the hostage over the cost of what it took us to get there, which is directly to your point, Ben, that these states who are fundamentally bad actors are very well taking advantage of our new posture and policy towards how we go about releasing hostages.
Just a few comments on this. First, the United States doesn't have the religious obligations that Israel has. There are Jewish religious obligations. Of course, people do disagree over the interpretation of what those obligations are, but the U.S. isn't burdened with that necessity of valuing sort of the humanity of the families, and of course, like, we would expect that families would trade anything, right? Any deterrence or national security to get their loved ones back. But the United States has the ability to separate those things from U.S. policy. And the fact that we're not doing that is condemnatory. Just to point out again, just like with what Ben was referencing about shipping lanes and keeping routes of commerce on the seas open, this is a very traditional foreign policy obligation for the United States. Having a blue passport used to mean F around and find out, right? The United States has always really aggressively protected our citizens abroad, even when we had much, much less power than we have now in terms of geopolitics, right? Famously, the guy behind me, Andrew Jackson, right? Basically threatened war with France over disrespect to American citizens abroad. Impressment of American sailors into the British Navy was considered also a reason for the United States to go to war, even though we didn't have the strength, or nobody thought that we did in 1812 to match the British Navy. We acquitted ourselves finally in that war very, very well, ultimately, but after enormous losses. But this is a very traditional foreign policy obligation of the United States. And the fact that we are now gaining for ourselves a reputation for negotiating with terrorists means that every citizen, all of us, we will be at higher risk abroad, because believe me, there are, there's an endless list of people, both, sort of petty and small, all the way up to the nation state level, who would love to squeeze a little money out of the United States, to squeeze concessions out of the United States. I mean, and so this is we need to restore that kind of deterrence that says, you don't touch American citizens abroad. It's going to be really bad for you if you do.
Yeah, I'm blown away by what we're seeing with the Red Sea, in the Red Sea, with what the Houthis are doing, and the fact that there hasn't been any sort of meaningful response or consequence to the Houthis going after international shipping. That's our responsibility as the global superpower to protect the sea lanes. That's the reason we spend so much money on the Navy. It's the reason we spend billions of dollars on our carrier fleets. Like, why what are we doing here? I have no clue what the Biden administration's on when it doesn't actually take action against the Houthis. There should be serious consequences for the Houthi leadership for messing with sea traffic. And it's not just about this particular incident. This is deterrence too. I mean, we need to deter attacks on sea traffic. It'll shut, allowing this. I mean, what next will we allow? I wouldn't be surprised to see a circumstance where China decides that actually we're going to be the ones who maintain international sea traffic from now on, because apparently the United States isn't powerful enough to do it anymore.
That probably will be China's reaction, and the Biden administration will say, well, we have a coalition of states that are going to come together and deal with the terrorist group that we de-designated as a terrorist group, the Houthis. By the way, it's also worth knowing the history here, just really briefly. The Navy was developed in large part to counter the Barbary pirates. So this is a complete repudiation.
The shores of Tripoli.
Precisely. So once again, bang up job here by the Biden administration. On that note, we'll go right back to Inez and talk about this controversy at Arlington.
Yeah, so we once again have a controversy over a statue. This time it is the Reconciliation Monument, which is a monument to Confederate dead during the Civil War, that is standing in Arlington Cemetery over the grave of its sculptor, Sir Moses Ezekiel. That becomes relevant legally in a moment. The fact that this is in fact a grave site. Like so many statues in 2020, this one was designated for toppling and removal by the soft regime change that I believe, sort of happened. When I look back on the summer of 2020, I think that there was a kind of soft coup. When you see statues toppling, generally it means the regime is changing. And indeed, I think we have lived through a type of regime change, although hopefully it's still a contested regime change. But so this was scheduled for removal in 2020. And of course, now as that removal is coming to fruition, there were some battles back and forth locally about whether or not it was appropriate to remove something that is literally a monument to the reconciliation of the United States after a brutal and violent civil war. The removal actually has been held up by a federal judge, Judge Rossi Alston Jr., who's a Trump appointee to the bench there. And we can hope that the litigation is going to go well. There's a group called Defend Arlington, by the way. I would just encourage people, if you have a little extra money, donating at the end of the year, consider them for your efforts. They have spent a lot of money trying to save this monument, and they're just a little local group without a lot of money. So for those legal bills, I'd really encourage you to go and donate to them. But so there is now a halt on bringing this reconciliation monument down, because the legislation under which it's coming down specifically excludes grave sites. This shouldn't even have to be something that's said, right? It shows the depths of sort of the revolutionary fervor of the left, that they have dug up the bones of Civil War generals from the Confederate side, because even, their grave sites are offensive to the new Maoists who seek to tear them down. I think that the lessons from this ongoing battle are really simple. They're lessons that Republicans, I hope, are starting to learn, but there are still way too many people on the right who think that this is some kind of historical game about the Confederate States of America, about the CSA, about slavery, about the Civil War. That's not what it's about. It's obviously never been about that. It was obvious in 2015 when these calls started going out to tear down the statues, that it's not about Confederates, that these people don't recognize any difference between Jefferson Davis and Thomas Jefferson, who he was named after, right? They're not interested in the actual facts of any of these statues or about the Civil War. This is, again, a reconciliation monument. They have this new, also mostly false and misleading narrative about how these statues went up as some kind of like intimidation tactic during either late Reconstruction or the Jim Crow South. Now, it's true that in some of the cases, when these statues went up, there were some, racially inflammatory speeches that were given. There's a small percentage of the speeches given. In fact, the overwhelming reason, when if you look at the dates of when these kinds of statues went up, more often than not, they're on 50th or 75th anniversaries of major battles or the surrender at Appomattox. And in fact, at the time they went up, Civil War veterans in America were very much as I think the World War II generation is to us today. They were this generation of Americans who had experienced this great calamity of Civil War. And they were getting into their 80s, into their 90s, and there was the last of them were sort of passing from living memory, right? And so a lot of the reason these statues went up was to reconcile and to remember the horrible experience that veterans on both sides went through. We had veterans from the Union side and from the Confederate side at many of these statue raisings together. So this really, most of these statues really did go up as a kind of remembrance and a celebration of the fact that, in fact, the United States was able to come back together after the war. Itself remarkable. I think it's worth pointing out here that these reasons are purely ideological. And I think one of the ways, the sort of cleanest and easiest way to describe how disconnected this is from the actual history of what happened and how ideological and in the moment it is that, these people have deeper objections to these statues than the actual veterans who lost lost their brothers in arms, and sometimes literally their brothers. They saw their friends and their families put in the ground by men under the command of, say, Robert E. Lee, and yet they didn't hold this kind of sort of self-righteous, like, everybody who was born before me is obviously a moral reprobate, and despite not having done anything a quarter as great or a tenth as great as what Lee's valet probably did during the war, a lot of we're going to have this sort of moral condemnation bonfire. But yes, this is not about the CSA, not about the Confederacy. Unfortunately, a lot of Republicans, a lot of people on the right, they still do get caught up in the idea of separating the good statues from the bad statues, and the reality is, you give these people an inch, they're going to take George Washington, and they've proved that over and over and over again. I don't know how many times they can prove it before everybody on the right understands that this is actually what the game is. But I hope it's soon. With that, I'll throw it out to the rest of you for commentary on this statue, or generally on these ongoing iconoclastic moments in the United States and what they represent.
I remember watching that video recently of the Washington Post recording the smelting of the Robert E. Lee statue that was removed from Charlottesville. And they claimed that it was being done secretly, and yet they had invited a mainstream media outlet there to film the entire process. And they did it in this way where they had made the scene look frankly demonic. It was dark. Except for the glowing embers coming from the statue. The angles went up close to Lee's face, and I think it was intended to be demoralizing. Inez is right. This is not about quibbles over the Civil War specifically, or good statues versus bad statues. This is a signal that the left does not want to reconcile with the right. They prefer things to be divided. They prefer to demoralize and humiliate their enemies. And conservatives who get caught up in trying to debate, well, Lee is obviously a different case than Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, they'll say. Never mind the fact that Robert E. Lee was pardoned by Abraham Lincoln, took a low-profile post that didn't pay very much after the war because he thought it was unseemly to be seen as profiting from the conflict. Had very complicated reasons for becoming a general on the Confederate side in the first place, and already had his home basically stolen from him and used as a cemetery for Union soldiers. Many Confederate soldiers weren't even brought to Arlington National Cemetery until much later. So the facts obviously don't line up with the left's narrative, or even some people on the right's narrative, particularly some libertarians who think it's no big deal to pull down statues. And I think what they did to the smelting of Lee, and then what they're trying to do to this reconciliation monument, makes it very clear that this is about a modern debate in the United States about general morality and what the future of the country looks like, as opposed to them just taking issue with the Civil War.
Yeah, I was thinking just now that the first story of today was the massive invasion of the border and the fact the administration is facilitating this complete, destruction of our southern border and, screw public safety. Then we have the discussion of paying terrorists and paying for hostages, negotiating with terrorists, failing to meet our basic responsibility to protect the sea lanes. And now this one is the destruction of our monuments, the destruction of our history, even parts of our history that were about reconciliation. And you sort of look at the left and you're like, this is a suicide cult. They want to destroy the country. In every respect, it's a different way of destroying a big part of what makes the United States of America distinct. Our population, our strength militarily, and our willingness to hold, maintain control of the sea lanes, and our history. And it's like all of them are just irrelevant. At a certain point, you wonder how long before we get a Democrat platform that's just about giving back land to people who and basically calling us colonizers, like handing back the entire Southwest to Mexico, handing back Indian reservations, the entire Mountain West over back to the Comanches or something. I don't think these people like our country very much, and I think they're going to be running it pretty soon unless we do something.
I'll just make one really narrow point, because I think we've hit the high notes about the notion that this is a bad faith exercise. It's not about distinguishing between statues. And of course, it starts with statues and it ends with people. And frankly, I think that ultimately, to the extent the trajectory continues and the speed at which it goes continues to accelerate, you're going to have people wanting to take down Martin Luther King statues because he wasn't committed enough to the cause. We're not all that far from that insane episode probably happening. And, you know, we could talk about the fact that, look, let's say you take all of the arguments against the merits of this particular statue as being 100% true, that it glorifies the South or it's somehow not really a symbol of reconciliation. Still, you have to recognize your entire history as a country. You would think the leftists would agree with that. They would say, yeah, let's recognize how evil and oppressive we were, even going back to the 1800s and then even prior to the 1800s as well. But of course they won't, because it's not really about the merits at the end of the day. It's about ideological warfare, and it is about tearing down all the roots of our country at the end of the day. One really narrow point that I'll make, which I find humorous in this episode, is if you actually look at the Commission on Renaming report, they say that, quote, contextualization was not an appropriate action. That's a direct quote when it comes to the statue. So context matters when it comes to genocide against Jews, when you're talking about Harvard's president or the president of another school. Context doesn't matter here when it comes to a reconciliation monument. And obviously the left wants no reconciliation, and they want to make the case that the right is just the new Confederates, even though the anti-racists themselves are really like the racist Democrats of the past historically, if we really want to go back to that history. The other point that I'll make, which probably hasn't really been made, and we'll go to a complete non-segue over to Amber to talk about homeschooling and the left's attack on it.
Sure, not necessarily a non sequitur, though, because I would posit that a lot of the points that we were just talking about are things that will be erased from history classes in public school. And so the left would really prefer that people don't homeschool their kids or send them to private school at risk of them hearing some inconvenient truths. The reason I started focusing on the left's attacks on homeschooling recently is that the Washington Post is actually running a year-long series on home education. And it started off innocent enough. Over the summer, they ran a couple of articles where they actually interviewed and ran some studies on parents who homeschool and found some interesting things. Homeschooling is more diverse than ever. It's less religious than it has ever been in history. It's less specifically Christian. And a lot of parents cited different reasons for why they've decided to start homeschooling their kids over the past few years. Some were concerned about COVID. Some wanted their kids actually learning instead of being kept home from public school and not being allowed to learn in person. Others were concerned about things like vaccine mandates and curriculum issues. But pretty much all of the parents agreed, about 75%, that they all had an issue with the morals that were being taught in public schools. And parents for a long time have really been shut out of the curriculum in public education. And there's been really a revolt against school boards across the country, and particularly where I live in Virginia, because of this, where parents are demanding more control over their kids' education. And in lieu of that, they're actually just pulling their kids out of the public schools entirely. And of course, as mentioned, the left hates this because it means that they don't have the opportunity to indoctrinate or brainwash your kids into narratives that run counter to your values. So the Washington Post, as it continued its year-long session on reporting on homeschooling, started to get very dark in the past couple of months. And they've now transitioned away from simply reporting on the rise of homeschooling to talking about how homeschooling is essentially a vector for abuse of children. And in one article titled, What Homeschooling Hides, a Boy Tortured and Starved by His Stepmom, the Washington Post essentially warns that parents will use homeschooling as a cover to abuse their kids privately without an educator or other trusted adult stepping in on the situation. And in order to prove their point, they cited a very dishonest study that only focused on 6 school districts in one state and did not publish the raw data. And they also claimed in the study that about half of students who were withdrawn from public school during a few-year time period went on to have founded or unfounded allegations of abuse. Now, obviously, it's bizarre that unfounded allegations would be included in this study, considering homeschooled parents get accused of abuse for all kinds of crazy reasons because there is a very public narrative that homeschool parents are indeed crazy. And then in addition to that, they also lumped in with homeschooled kids who were either not legally homeschooled, as in they had not been registered to be homeschooled, or kids who were merely truant from public school. So their parents hadn't taken them out to homeschool them. They just stopped sending their kids to any type of education process entirely. The Washington Post went on to attack a man who was behind a lot of homeschool research in the United States, Dr. Ray, and in the process quoted an organization that's called the Coalition for Responsible Home Education. I went to this organization's website. They also somehow claim that homeschool kids are subject to more abuse, even though they admit that the one study they commissioned with empirical data did not find any statistically significant evidence that that was the case. But they have a database of so-called victims of homeschooling. And in that database, they include none other than Elizabeth Smart, who was never homeschooled. The only reason that homeschool is at all relevant to the Elizabeth Smart case is because her deranged kidnappers who took her from her actual home told her to tell concerned adults who asked her what her deal was that she was homeschooled. So it's a very dishonest organization. I wonder how much of these reports that the Post has been running on so-called homeschooling abuse came directly from this group. I'm going to look more into this, but it seems like a very controlled op that's going on conveniently as homeschooling becomes more popular than ever.
Yeah, so obviously this is a response to the rise in homeschooling, and one of the things that I mean, in the ed policy world has been obvious for a long time, but I think some people who aren't sort of as engaged as in this particular issue might not know. I mean, homeschooling, the face of homeschooling has changed enormously, even before the pandemic, from the 90s and the 2000s. That is not to say that there were child abusers in the 90s or 2000s. Want to be very clear about that. But usually homeschoolers in the 90s and the 2000s, if they were withdrawing their kids from school, either private or public school, they had some really, really sort of fringe objections to the way that mainstream society was going. Now, I think a lot of those objections have turned out to be quite prophetic, but you tended to have two groups of people. It was either like really left-wing hippies, or it was people who are extremely religious Christians, and they were outside of the mainstream bell curve of like where American society was at that time. Again, this is not a criticism of them. This is just the people who took at that time that extraordinary step. Remember, in the 80s, homeschooling in a lot of states was still illegal. Even through the 90s, there were like a lot of legal barriers to doing it. So there was necessarily, not to mention the cultural sort of stigma around it and everything. So it was necessarily a very dedicated and sort of outside of society group that was dedicated to homeschooling. That's completely and utterly transformed in recent decades. I think that's a testament to how radical the mainstream has gotten, that so many people who are, in that fat part of the bell curve, they're not people who, who there were people until recently who were very engaged in sort of their schools, their communities, like their ordinary moms, ordinary dads, right? Who don't have this huge objection, or wouldn't have had the mainstream culture, and particularly what has been taught in public schools and some private schools, gotten so radical itself, right? So I think it's a large reflection. The fact that the face of homeschooling has changed is a reflection of how radical our cultural transformation really has, and how those battles have been fought out in the school system. As to outcomes, it's very difficult to find studies that are negative about the outcomes of homeschooling. There are a lot of confounds because, again, you have to be very dedicated to teach your kid at home, and they have a one-on-one situation, or at least siblings on one situation oftentimes. So, but in terms of outcomes, in terms of later life outcomes and testing, college attendance rates, et cetera, any outcome that we can measure in terms of what kids are actually learning, they learn more and better in a homeschool environment than they do elsewhere. Also, homeschooling now a lot of times includes contact with other adults. This is very relevant to the concern about, well, nobody's going to tell, there'll be no other adults to see that the children are being abused. That's just not the case with most homeschool kids anymore. You're talking about co-ops, you're talking about swaps, you're talking about like huge fairs for books and materials and learning equipment. So this is a very public now community. These are families that find each other. This is no longer sort of a fringe and isolating experience that it might have been in the 90s or in the 80s. So, and just one final point. HSLDA, the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and other organizations have done a fantastic job over the last, it's really one of those sort of small unsung victories for conservatism. They really have protected homeschooling legally quite well in virtually most states in the country. And even those states that still have some substantive barriers to homeschooling, they're so much less than they were in the 80s and 90s, when it really was kind of dangerous to homeschool your child, legally dangerous for families to actually choose to educate their child how they see fit, right? And so they've done a really good job with that. And so fortunately, those rights are protected. That is not the default, even in the Western world. This is kind of like how on free speech, First Amendment protects us much more than in European countries or the UK. Same thing here. I mean, Germany and makes homeschooling illegal. France, it's practically illegal. Somebody from the government will come to your door if you homeschool and make sure that you're teaching the approved French version of what happened during their revolution. I mean, they will interfere that much into what you're teaching your child. So I know I've gone on. This is like a really important subject, close to my heart. Homeschooling is great. I'm glad it's really, really protected in US states. And yeah, this is obviously a coordinated hit against a wonderful educational option for so many children.
I'll go somewhat quick. I don't have a lot to say about homeschooling in particular, but the failure of our public education system. There's a great podcast that you should listen to if you haven't, called Sold a Story. It's about the absolute failure of public schools to effectively teach reading in the last decade or so. They adopted a new theory of how to teach reading that basically encouraged children to guess what words were rather than teaching them phonics and the ability to sound out those words so they can become effective readers. As a result, fourth graders, or something like 65% of fourth graders, are unable to read at grade level, far lower than in the past. And a good chunk of this is about the dominance of this particular method of reading teaching that actually had to be outlawed in a number of states because the education establishments were so pathetic at it. So I highly recommend the podcast called Sold a Story. I mean, it's really fascinating and disturbing that our public school system could fail at the most basic task it has, which is to teach children to read.
I think it goes in line with the idea that the state, generalizing here, of course, wants to create ignorant and indoctrinatable sheep, and the state is going to produce good citizens based upon the way the state defines good citizens, which are citizens who are going to be the decolonization effort in America. And why are parents such an obstacle, or why are they perceived, well, first treated as domestic terrorists by our national security apparatus, and now I guess being cast as child abusers? Well, it's because intact families and families where parents actually have influence over their children and inculcate in them an actual education plus core values and principles are a threat to the kind of citizens that the regime wants to create, and hence the backlash against homeschooling. And I imagine there's going to be a massive regulatory backlash to go along with it also, but first they have to try and soften the ground by winning the messaging war. And so I think this is probably part of a long-term coordinated hit, and we'll probably see it intensify going forward. And on that note, I will open up our parting shots by talking about another info op that's currently in process, which is with respect to the Supreme Court. About a week ago, we're recording this on Tuesday, the New York Times put out a piece that I kind of read as a successor to the Politico Dobbs Week piece, which actually printed the draft opinion, which ultimately ended up being more or less the actual final Supreme Court opinion in the Dobbs case. And the New York Times goes into very inside baseball about the court's deliberations, the kinds of details that I don't know that we've ever seen before in terms of reporting on deliberations around a decision and internal jockeying for positioning and all of the internal politics that actually go into how justices agree on ultimately what a final opinion will look like and how they get other justices to come over to their side, et cetera. This continues, in my view, to pierce the privacy and the secrecy by which a court must function. And to the extent you expose what the internal deliberations are like and jockeying is like, first of all, this means that it could happen again down the road. And second of all, it's going to dramatically change how justices actually deliberate going forward. I think, as I argued at the time, the fact that the court never found but never really engaged in the robust investigation that needed to happen to bring the person who leaked the opinion to justice, we're going to see compounding problems as a result of it. And I think the integrity of the court and the institution itself is under threat under the chief institutionalist of all time, Justice John Roberts, who claims above all to care about protecting the integrity of the institution. This is another strike against it. And I see this, as I've argued before, as part and parcel of a running information operation to discredit and delegitimize the Supreme Court narrowly, but very importantly, in advance of 2024, where we already have questions in terms of immunity questions in the Trump January 6th case coming before it. And we're very likely to see other major rulings that have a bearing on the 2024 presidential election come before it as well. So the question is going to be, will the court hold in the face of that offensive? Obviously, you have the likes of ProPublica continuing the attacks on Justice Thomas, ridiculous attacks on him, which is also part and parcel of this effort. Will the court hold up in the face of what I think is going to be the most intense pressure campaign that we've ever seen against it during 2024? I am not sanguine on this, but I hope my pessimism proves misplaced ultimately. We'll see what happens on that count in the year ahead. With that, I'll turn it over to others for their parting shots.
Yeah, my parting shot this week is about the Harvard-Harris poll that came out. It asks some questions that the headlines are all about Israel and Gaza, and indeed the sort of the data that's coming out is a sharp generational divide over this question. But I think there's an even more important result in this poll that's sort of buried in a few pages in for the United States, and shows how connected all these issues are. That if you hate, if you can't stand to the idea that Israel might defend itself against attacks like we saw on October 7th, generally that springs from this oppressor-oppressed dichotomy, and it's applied to the United States as well. So 2/3 of Americans 18 to 24 believe that Jews are oppressors, while 73% of voters overall disagree with that statement, right? So again, you see this massive disconnect between essentially, especially people 18 to 24, but really pushing, you see a fulcrum developing right around people who are around 35 right now. And I think that tracks very much to the takeover of the K-12 system. The university system has been captured by the left for a much longer period of time, but the K-12 system is really right around the last couple of decades, where people who are 35 were doing their school years last 2 or 3 decades. So it also in this poll, right, you see that same age group, 18 to 24, explicitly agreeing that in the poll question, it's written that 1,200 murders and 250 kidnappings of Israeli civilians are justified by Palestinian grievances against Israel. So it says murdering and kidnapping of civilians is justified by Palestinian grievances against Israel, again, because the oppressed can do no wrong against the oppressor, right? They actually, strangely, that same group by a majority acknowledges that October 7th attack was genocidal. So they agree that it was genocidal, but they think it's justified. Again, that oppressor and oppressed dichotomy that doesn't just apply to Israel and Gaza. If you flip through deeper into the poll, you see that voters 18 to 24 once again agree that, quote, the ideology that white people are oppressors and non-white people and people of certain groups have been oppressed is favored on campus. They agree that it's favored on campus. But while voters as a whole think this is a bad thing, the majority of both 18 to 24 and then even all the way up into, again, people into their early 30s. So that's really the younger half of millennials and Gen Z agree that it's a good thing. This ideology that white people are oppressors is a good thing. it's just additional context for what I think we all understand on this show. There is a sort of generational warfare going on. America did turn over our education systems to people who had no desire to form self-governing citizens of the American Republic with any kind of respect. I mean, it goes to what Will was saying about all of our topics here today, and all of them having the common thread of really wanting to destroy the United States. And I think actually, if you polled that question, you're likely to find that Americans under the age of 25 think that they're ambivalent about the destruction of the United States at best. Same reason that they think Osama bin Laden had a point when he was criticizing the United States. They have placed this country into the oppressor category, and therefore all of our enemies can do no wrong against us, even up to the point of violence or even genocidal violence. I think that's something that is worth taking seriously and not to be dismissed because they're ignorant on a few facts, you know, the way that they are about which river and which sea. I think the ideology and the perspective is in deadly earnest.
I will also use my final thoughts to talk about something that is of grave threat to the United States, which is the effects of decriminalization of drugs, specifically in Portland, which decriminalized back in 2020. There's an amazing article in The Spectator by Kevin Dahlgren, who has been working in homeless and addiction outreach for 30 years. And his description of what's happened in Portland is truly jarring. He says that he interviewed hundreds of homeless individuals who describe inhuman shrieking, daily overdoses and deaths right in front of them because of the proliferation of drugs in Portland. And although the decriminalization effort was supposed to be matched with detox and rehab centers, naturally, because the drugs have become so readily available and so cheap, there's simply never going to be enough infrastructure to handle this problem, nor are there enough outreach officers to even track down the people who are deep in the throes of addiction. And so I think it's a really important perspective to read for some of our libertarian friends out there who might be quite on board with the idea of decriminalizing drugs under the auspices of basically avoiding sending people to prison when they are addicts. I think the reality in this situation that should be quite obvious is that sometimes the threat of imprisonment is the only way to get people help if they refuse to choose it on their own.
My final thought is, yeah, I'm still here. My final thought is the hubbub about Nikki Haley potentially being a VP candidate under Trump. And Trump himself was asked point blank about whether he would do that. And he said he deferred. He said he might. Meanwhile, he's also getting mad at Chip Roy for being a rhino and wants to primary him, even though the primary deadline was a week ago. But in any event, I think I saw that, there was discussion about this, Tucker Carlson saying, well, this will be a red line. I absolutely won't vote for the ticket. And I've noticed that there's just this negotiation that happens among Trump supporters who hate Nikki Haley for good reason, but they're trying to ensure that Trump doesn't actually do this. And they're either like really over aggressively threatening not to vote for him, or they're sort of appealing to Trump's bare naked self-interest by saying he'll be assassinated in the event that Nikki Haley is the VP because, forces will want Nikki Haley as VP. And, I just think to myself, it doesn't have to be this way. You could nominate somebody who isn't inclined to nominate one of the worst people in the party. There's a governor down in Florida who I used to work for who's pretty cool. People should look into him.
Well, on that note, first of all, on a sunnier note than most of the topics on this episode, Merry Christmas to all who celebrate. On behalf of Inez, Amber, and Will, thanks for tuning in. I'm Ben Weingarten, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.